Amen. Thank you, worship team. Life Journey worship team began on a cold January day in a little cabin in Branson with four people that are still singing on worship team and playing on the worship team today. And even though we have a long way to grow, it's amazing to see how God is moving and working. And I'm thankful for each of these guys that prepare and take care of instruments and all the things that it takes to be here on Sunday and lead us in worship. All right, well, as we get started today, I've kind of picked a topic that is probably pretty personal. It can easily be misunderstood that we're pointing the finger at other people. But today, I think it's good for us to start off realizing that as we look at this very serious, this very direct, and this almost dramatic, I don't know if you want to call it message, accusation, rebuke that Jesus gives the religious leaders of His time, we have to realize that there's a danger that each of us has the potential within ourselves to become like those religious leaders, to become corrupt, to miss the point of what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a church. And so I want us to start out with a focus not on, other people or maybe a bad church experience that you've had in the past, but to look inward, to examine ourselves, to make sure that we're not those people. Because what's fascinating about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes is they thought that they were leading people to God when they were really leading people away from God. And this Friday, 11 of us will head out to literally almost the other side of the world. If you have a globe, my oldest son has one in his room. You can put a finger on Missouri in the United States on one side, and Ukraine is almost completely on the total opposite side. We're going to go to a culture that is very different from ours. Not only just the climate and those kind of things, but very different in the way that they see things, different in the history in which they've lived. We're going to share in 2 weeks when we come back. The team will share that morning or that afternoon all about the trip. And so be praying for us. Be praying for those 11 people. Bobby and Rhonda and Thomas weren't able to be here today and be prayed for, but please remember them as well as the rest of the team that was here. We'll post some updates on Oasis and let you guys know how things are going. And I would ask, just the same as I asked with the Suriname team last year, if you would make a commitment to pray once a day at least for these team members, for protection, that God's work would not be inhibited by the enemy, and that good things would happen. It's exciting. It's exciting to realize that God's working not only here in our community, but He's also working on the other side of the world. And He's working in all these places, in languages where we don't speak, cultures we don't understand, and people that live very differently than us. And it's exciting that we worship the same God and that we have the same purpose. So as we begin to look at Matthew chapter 23, and I'll give you a chance, hopefully you've kind of looked up there on the slide and you've had a chance to find it. Let's begin to go through and read this. It reads almost like, when I'm thinking of our current predicament. And of course I heard several conversations at lunch, so I know people are concerned about the government shutdown tomorrow that is most extremely likely to take place. I think there is a sense of urgency and a sense of everybody can kind of stand back and look at the situation and say, we're grossly in debt. We're talking about going even deeper into debt, and we're adding all these things that we can't afford, and probably for most of us we stand back and kind of wonder, well, why can people, and I'm not accusing any party or any certain group, but why can't people that lead our country see it the same way? Why can't they take a step back and look at the simplicity of the situation? But that's part of the problem with deception. When you get in the middle of things and there's this cloud, this shroud of mist that keeps us from seeing what's in front of us, then we can become very lost. I've been out in the forest, and I've been out when the ground's still warm, but the air is cold, and so you get a real heavy fog, and you can't really see. And without a good compass or something that gives you a sense of direction, it's very easy to get lost. Because you can't really get a bearing, and that's part of the problem that we're going to read about here today. That the Pharisees they lost their bearing. They really lost a tether, some path that was moving towards God, and they begin going in a different direction. And so now Jesus makes these very serious accusations, and he calls them out. So let's begin reading in verse 1. Jesus spoke to the crowds and to his disciples. So what's interesting to me is that this was not something that happened kind of privately. At this point, Jesus was very publicly and very directly rebuking these leaders. The scribes and the Pharisees are seated in the chair of Moses. Okay, so let's pause. We can't get very far before we have to kind of pause and what does that mean, the chair of Moses? That's a little cryptic, I think, probably of a statement. So you remember, Moses is the one who led the Israelites out of slavery when they were slaves in Egypt, and he delivered them not yet to the promised land, but to the wilderness, where they were going to kind of wander around and get reoriented and kind of get their foundation laid right as a nation before they went into the promised land. But he was the leader that led them out of slavery. So he says the scribes and Pharisees are seated in the chair. So in other words, they've been given this great responsibility. Therefore, continuing in verse 3, therefore do whatever they tell you and observe it. Now, I think this is a fascinating statement, given what's about to take place, given the comments that are about to be given. But notice that the sentence doesn't stop there. But don't do what they do, because they don't practice what they teach. All right, so very quickly we're at the heart of the matter. And I don't think you probably can go to life's journey for very long before you hear somebody say how you live and what you do is a reflection of who you really are, of what you really believe. So that's a core value that we hold, that we ought to hold, I believe. And here Jesus is basically saying, listen to what they say, but don't do what they do. So there's this very strange and very crazy notion that's being portrayed that these leaders have the truth, they have the Word of God, all right? They have the old law, the Torah, and they're even teaching from it, and they're speaking from it, and yet their lives are speaking a completely different truth. So it obviously is a big problem. Jesus says, they tie up heavy loads that are hard to carry, and they put them on people's shoulders, but they themselves aren't willing to lift a finger. All right, so let's talk about that. All right, and this whole message is going to be kind of a go, pause. All right, so it's like being in heavy traffic. All right, so just pretend we're downtown St. Louis and we're in heavy traffic and we're just stopping and going and stopping and going. All right, we're just going to kind of have to slowly make it through this. All right, so they tie up heavy loads. So in other words, especially in Leviticus, if you've ever read Leviticus, there are a large number of laws and very tedious, legalistic things that Jews were supposed to do, that the Hebrew people were supposed to do. And so the Pharisees were very quick to point out and to teach all of these things very distinctly and very frequently. They would teach all of these things, and yet they themselves wouldn't do it. Does that sound familiar? Can you think of any group in leadership that they have some standards and some things that they have to do, and yet there's inconsistency between what they're saying that we ought to do and what they're doing. All right, so maybe think about that. Hopefully you're not thinking of me. Maybe you are. Maybe I'm sure there's some things where I'm saying, you should do this, and then here I am, I'm walking over here. So that's a danger. We ought to be careful of that. So this heavy load then is being placed, and so people are, what naturally happens when a heavy load is placed on you, you began to waver, you began to be crushed, you began to be damaged. And so the people were struggling under this situation, because on the one hand they have these religious people saying you ought to do this, and their lives were living this out. And so I'm sure, for me, I would just be like, forget it. This is impossible. And these guys over here, they're saying all these things, and they're not even doing it. One of the things that happened very commonly is the Pharisees, they would have these kind of secret prostitutes, and they would go to them in the night, and yet they would appear in the temple, and they would say, that committing adultery is this terrible sin, and blah blah blah. And so we're not just talking about they didn't sacrifice the lamb properly, and we're talking about some very serious, very deep problems and inconsistencies in their teaching. Verse 5, they do everything to be observed by others. They enlarge their phylacteries and lengthen their tassels. Okay, so it's just dealing with outward appearance. All right, things that the way that they dress. There was this snail that excretes a very small and very rare purple ink. And they would harvest these snails, and they would put these purple stripes kind of on their tassels. You know what a tassel is, it kind of hangs down. And they would paint them, and the kind of how it was the thicker the tassel you had, that was like the more spiritually mature you were. All right, so let's apply that to modern times. So, like the bigger the fish maybe you have on your car, or maybe the bigger the cross you have on your T-shirt, or maybe, the bigger your, I don't know, you figure out what that is. But, we have those things, don't we? Those outward signs of, I'm a Christian, maybe I have a real big cross necklace. And none of those things are bad. Those things are all good things. But sometimes we use them as a substitute. Now, I think it's really cool. All of our youth are dressed up today, and so I think that's kind of cool. And there was a time in church where we would use clothing really to demonstrate how spiritually mature we were. So the more dressed up we were, well, that must mean the more spiritually mature we are. And really, just like with the Pharisees, that really meant you're wealthier. You're certainly wealthier. If you could afford all that purple ink from that little snail, then you were wealthier. That was the difference. It wasn't that you were necessarily more spiritually mature or more godly. It was because you had more money to purchase that ink with. So all these external things, and Jesus is calling them out. He's very clear. He says, they love the place of honor at banquets, the front seats in the synagogues, greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called rabbi by the people. At the end of verse 7. So they want people to think that they're great. Now, you know what? That's not such a foreign thing for us. Don't you want people to think that you're great? You don't want people to think you're just a miserable person. Do you really? So we all have that desire, right? We want to be accepted. We want people to feel like we have gifts and abilities, and that we're valuable, and that we're needed. Sometimes we just want to be needed. We want to be able to contribute something significantly in church or in our families or at work. And so we have this deep need and this desire, and if we're not careful, we can want it so bad that we kind of exchange the heart of that, the truth of that, for something external, for something that doesn't really exist. That's why a lot of times parents or people who beat their children, they put Band-Aids on them. When they hurt them, they try to cover that up to keep the truth from being known so that no one turns them in. And that's a sign. A lot of times teachers look for that. If they have students that come in and they have a lot of Band-Aids, and they begin to wonder, well, something may be wrong. Now, in my family's case, my children just are crazy and rowdy, and they scrape themselves all the time. I'm sure that no one else's kids are like that. But And a lot of times when it's just consistent and happens all the time, that's what's going on. And so we become very good at covering things up, at putting an external, and it's just like our cars. A lot of times we'll pay a lot of money to have that little ding taken out of our car, or to have that paint, nice and even on our car. We'll spend a lot of money doing that so that externally, our car may badly need an oil change and new spark plugs and all kinds of things, but on the outside, it's looking great. But on the inside, we may need some serious work done. But somehow we tend to gravitate that way, and that's how the Pharisees were. They wanted people to think that they were great, that they were teacher. So what does Jesus say about it? He says, "But as for you, do not be called rabbi." That's an interesting statement. "And you are all brothers. Do not call anyone on earth your father, because you have one Father who is in heaven. And do not be called masters either, because you have one Master, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant." All right, so Jesus basically is saying then, okay, so what I want you to do is now exchange all these external things, all these outside things. I want you to forget about that, and what really matters is the person who, behind the scenes, where nobody sees, where nobody knows, where they are serving, where they humble themselves, they consider themselves to be less, and so they are servants. And he is saying that is what it means to be great. That's what it means to be a true teacher. And just think about that for a minute. Because isn't that right? I mean, we learn by what we see, right? We do learn by what we hear, but if we study family psychology, 90+% of the time, children learn what their parents do, not what their parents say. So if we say, well, you child, you can't watch this show because it's an adult show, what are you really saying? Well, what you're saying is, you can watch this bad, evil show when you're older. That's what you're saying, right? But we don't realize that's what we're saying. If there's some reason why they shouldn't be watching it, that probably means what? We probably shouldn't be watching it, right? And so here we are, even in the smallest of things, it's complicated. And we're complicated by this double standard. Because on the one hand, I think many of us, we know the truth, we know how we should live, we know the choices that we ought to make, and yet we struggle to do them. All right, so there's really two things. There's really two things that cause hypocrisy. One, there is the failure to achieve a certain standard, even though we're trying. But then there's also this kind of artificial trying to fake it. When we realize we're not going to quite hit the target, well, we try to fake it. We try to put paint over it and make it look good, so that people externally will think that we hit the target. So it's really a two-pronged issue. And so I think we have to look at that and be honest with ourselves and say that it's a problem. It's a problem in the church. It's a problem in our families. It's a problem in our country and our nation as leadership. And until we fix this problem as a culture, we are going to continue to suffer and to struggle and have the same problems that we have now. It's not going to just suddenly get better. I think somehow in our minds, we think, well, if I'll just wait for a while, then something's going to get better. And maybe that's the case. There are times when we need to wait, right, so that things will get better. But a lot of times, things aren't getting better because of the choices that we're making or we're not making, that we need to be making. I've had the privilege of talking to a lot of different families this week and a lot of different issues, and that's just part of being a pastor. And I don't enjoy that we all struggle with things, but I enjoy getting to sit down and talk through some of those difficulties. And one of the things that comes up a lot is this idea that we have to be able to, as families, as couples, parents and children, husbands and wives, sometimes it's grandparents and their kids, regarding their grandchildren. There's so many different developments of it. There's the employee-employer relationship. There's so many ways to think about it. But we have to realize that the choices that we make either to solve the problem or to ignore the problem, to a large extent will determine whether we're able to move forward and have success, whether it's in our job, in our family, in a marriage. That we have to choose to talk it out, to deal with the problem. And we don't like that. Naturally, I'm kind of a peacemaking guy. I'm kind of a live and let live. That's just kind of how I roll. And I don't like to get into somebody else's business and into their, in their face and say, hey, you're going on in a bad way here. You need to get back on the right path. See, we don't like to do that. But yet, it's required sometimes. Sometimes we've got to, and there's an element of humility, because if we find ourselves getting in people's face all the time, and we never see ourselves humbling ourselves and saying, man, you know what, I really messed up. I'm really sorry about that. How can we make that right? If we don't hear ourselves saying that very often, that probably means that we have some arrogance, an arrogance issue. Think about that for just a minute. Don't raise your hand. But in the last 7 days, in the last week, how many times have you said, hey, I'm really sorry, I was wrong, and how can I make that right? How can I work that out with you? See, everybody's starting to squirm a little bit. I would venture to say that there's not very many times that those words have come out of our mouth, probably. And so see, it's an epidemic, it's a problem, because we think like the Pharisees, don't we? We think we know, we think we have the answers, and even if we don't, we want to fool everybody into thinking that we do. Sometimes as a leader, one of the best responses you can give to someone who asks you something is to say, I don't know. And that's hard. When somebody considers you maybe to be knowledgeable about a certain area or to be skilled in a certain way, you want to be able to give them that answer and to show them how to do that certain skill, because we want people to think highly of us. We want people to respect us and to think we have value. But we can't gain it artificially, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious leaders are trying to do. Let's read on. Jesus has just said that the greatest among you will be your servant in verse 11. And so now in verse 12 he says, whoever exalts himself will be humbled. Whoever humbles himself will be exalted. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Exclamation mark. Okay, so what does woe mean? Okay, so that's a word that doesn't come up a lot. Excuse me, had too much good lunch. And whenever we hear that woe, we're like, okay, what does that mean? Like if I ever say the word woe, it's kind of like, whoa, slow down, But this woe, W-O-E, is basically meaning this is a warning. I am warning you, scribes and Pharisees. I am rebuking you in love, scribes and Pharisees. And of course, he doesn't beat around the bush. He says very solidly, very succinctly, hypocrites, you devour widows' houses and make long prayers just for show. All right, so we're back to that external appearance. And this is why you will receive a harsher punishment. Now let's just think about that for a minute, because there's a very important element here. And we have a room full of people that are leaders. That we have people that in this room that have left their church several years ago to come out and to begin a new work where there wasn't one before. We have people that have been elders and deacons and pastors, and so we have a lot of great leadership. And when you stand in front of people, maybe it's just 2 or 3 people that you're mentoring in your life, you become a leader. In fact, frankly, I would make the argument that anyone who is a follower of Christ is by default a leader. Because our objective is to live a life that brings glory to God. And so we are teaching people. We are leading people as we do that, as we live that. Because guys, if it has not occurred to you, we live in a post-Christian culture. And it hurts me to say that, because I can even remember when I was a little kid that we lived in a Christian culture, that by and large people shared Christian values, and there were basic moral principles that as you would go down the street, people shared, we don't live in a world like that anymore. Well, in a country like that. If you go to South Korea, it's pretty much like that. But if you're here in the United States, we are a minority. We are a subculture. And so we are going, it's just like walking upstream. You know, if you've ever been in the Colorado River, I mean, that thing is moving, all right? And that's how our culture is moving. And we're going the other way. We're moving up against that. And that's, I mean, if you ever try to walk upstream, you don't get real far real fast. I mean, that's a hard task. And so we are leading people as believers. And so, what does Jesus say? We are going to be held to a higher standard. And it just makes sense, right? We have the truth. We know the truth. The truth has been given to us. That at some point, if we're a Christian, really what we're saying is, at some point, we have come to the Lord in prayer and we've said that we admit that we're sinners, that we believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and we've committed our lives to Him. That's what we've done. And as we've made that decision, that commitment, then we become ones that are leaders. Because to follow Christ means to be on mission, to live a missional lifestyle. And that means that we are leading people towards Christ. And if we fail to do that, then there will be consequences. Now, I'll be honest with you, that scares me a little. It ought to scare you, I think, a little bit. It ought to make you really think a moment about how we're living our lives. There are days where I really wish that free will would just go away. Where I could just say, God, would you just live my life for me? I'm tired of making bad choices. I'm tired of being tempted to sin. And I just want you to lead me. Boy, I am looking forward to the day when that really happens. When we go home to be with the Lord and we enter into His kingdom, and that's our existence. But that time has not yet come. I mean, if you were in this room and you're hearing me, that means you are very much alive. And so we are fighting this war against a culture of darkness. And our goal is not to destroy the enemy, but to redeem them. To redeem them from the enemy's camp and bring them into our own. And so Jesus says, don't be a hypocrite. Don't speak one thing and live out something else. Let's go on. Woe to you. So we see woe again. So a warning to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. You travel over land and sea to make one proselyte. And when he becomes one, you make him twice as fit for hell as you are. Exclamation mark. Okay, now, for me, the Jesus that I'm seeing right here is not the Jesus that I like to think of. All right? The Jesus I like to think of is gentle and He's kind and He's going around serving people and He's seeking out the sinners and He's gently helping them see truth and delivering them from a lifestyle of death and pain and suffering. And that's the Jesus I like to think of, right? I don't like to think of the Jesus who is standing there pointing a finger and condemning these religious leaders for their poor leadership. And yet, there's some pretty strong words. Basically, he's saying you're taking someone who's already in darkness and you are making the situation even worse. In other words, it would have been better for them to have never met you. And that's a pretty strong statement. So I think we have to ask that question of ourselves. Are we creating stumbling blocks for people coming to church? Are we creating stumbling blocks for them seeing who Jesus is by our own choices? See, that's hard. And right away I can think of 10 different ways that some choices that I've made and some ways that I live my life have become an obstacle for people when my whole goal is to reach them and to share truth with them. Let's continue on. I'm not sure that I want to, but I know that we ought to. Woe to you, warning to you, blind guides who say, whoever takes an oath by the sanctuary, it means nothing, but whoever takes an oath by the gold of the sanctuary is bound by his oath. Blind fools, for which is greater, the gold or the sanctuary that sanctified the gold? Also, whoever takes an oath by the altar, it means nothing, but whoever takes an oath by the gift that is on it is bound by his oath. Okay, so we see a lot of talks about oath. And if you remember about a month ago or so when we were going through Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, we came upon this idea of the oath, of taking the oath. And people were swearing by heaven or by earth or by different things. I swear I'll do this, I promise I'll do this. And Jesus corrects that teaching. He says, let your yes be your yes, let your no be your no. And it was amazing. I went home that next week and all of a sudden my kids stopped saying, oh, Dad, I'll promise I'll do this. I'll promise I'll clean my room if you'll just let me do this. All of a sudden it's like, okay, I'm giving you my word. I'm going to clean my room. So that's good that we had some people that took some things away from that. So here we have the same problem that somehow Pharisees were manufacturing and creating this special oath, this special commitment, that if you made this oath and if you put money on it or if you put your reputation on it, that it meant something and it had more value. When they were creating basically this false religion. And we don't have a problem with that in this world, do we? Lots of false religions. Well, let's see. There are 8 major world religions and some 300 and some other, minor religions or cults that exist in the world today, and that's of the people groups that we can even communicate with. So false teaching is a problem because everyone can't be right. Either Allah is God or Jehovah is God, but they can't both be. So it's a problem. We don't really think about the logic of it. A lot of times we like to mix together all these teachings. That's like the clerical cross. They're real popular now, and you see them a lot. That's during the Irish revival, the time when Christianity spread through Ireland. The Druids became Christians, and so if you ever see the cross that has the kind of the round thing at the top with like the little arms, the clerical cross, that's because really what happened was they married. They didn't want to, lose their pagan Druidic beliefs, so they kind of kept the cleric symbol and married it with the cross. See? And so then they kind of blended things together, and that's what we like to do. We like to harmonize some things together because we don't really want to get rid of some of the things that we like from our sinful past, and so we kind of try to marry them with Christianity. We try to make excuses for them. And pretty soon, we become like the Pharisees. Pretty soon, we're teaching other people to do these same things. And so I think we have to be very careful to look at our lives because sometimes we don't realize we're doing that. In fact, I would say most of the time, I think in a sense, we have good intentions. Of course, we know that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But we have good intentions because we want people to be better, to be happy, and so as we live our lives, as we make choices, and as we kind of let people into our lives, and our lives intermingle, we have a temptation to compromise. But there can only be one truth. Black is, I'm looking at this music stand, Caleb's, and it's got black and white on it, and those are the only 2 colors. And no matter how I reason it out, there are 2 colors on that paper. They're black and they're white. And somehow, though, when we start talking about truth, we start talking about morality, we start to say, oh, well, no, there's gray and blue and purple, and we manufacture all these other colors that really aren't there. And so it's a problem. Blind people, continuing in verse 19. For which is greater, the gift or the altar that sacrifices the gift? Therefore, the one who takes an oath by the altar takes an oath by it and by everything on it. The one who takes an oath by the sanctuary takes an oath by it and by him who dwells in it. And the one who takes an oath by heaven takes an oath by God's throne and by him who sits on it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You pay 1/10 of mint, dill, and cumin, and yet you have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. These things should have been done without neglecting the others. Okay, so in other words, and I understand that was a little confusing. In other words, Jesus is listing a number of things, good things, all right, but the Pharisees selected the things they wanted to do, and what I would argue are probably some of the easier things, and they pulled them out, and they ignored some of the harder things, like not lying, being humble, loving people, showing grace, showing forgiveness. See, they didn't want to do those things because those are harder and they take more time, and they chose some of the easier things, and then they exalted these things and said, this is what matters. Now, I'll be honest with you, that sounds very familiar to me. And to this day, I believe that in most every church, and perhaps even our own, there are some sins that are worse than others. And there are some righteous acts that are greater than others. But Jesus says, no, that's not the case at all. All of these things are what I've taught you to do. And you can't pick and choose the ones that you want and just say, oh, well, I'm weak in this area. And so we kind of scrub it under the rug and be like, well, nobody's perfect. And we forget about it and move on. Jesus says, blind guides, you strain at a gnat, yet gulp down a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee! First clean the inside of the cup, so the outside of it may also become clean. Now, I think that's an interesting way to say it. All right, and I can relate to that. You know, I sit down, I have a cereal bowl, and I look at it, and I'm not really concerned as much with the outside of the bowl as I am the inside, right? Because that's where I'm going to pour my cereal in, I'm going to pour my milk in, and I'm going to be eating from the inside. But the Pharisees, they weren't concerned with the inside. It could be all nasty and have, leftover lasagna scrapings from whatever from before, and they were just waxing and cleaning the outside so it looked so nice from the outside. But they were taking in filth. They were eating filth. And Jesus is saying, that's what it's like whenever we get things backwards. Whenever we start focusing more on what's outside than what's inside. So, in other words, instead of getting up in the morning and thinking, man, what am I going to wear to church? What am I going to, let's see, how shiny, should I shine my guitar up? Make sure it's really shiny because it's going to play so much better when it's been waxed and Windexed and it's real shiny. Or should I get my nails done, or should I fix my hair? See, those are the wrong questions. Those things are fine. Those things are good. There's nothing wrong. In fact, I think we should probably, kind of pull it together a little bit and look presentable at church. So I don't think that's a bad thing at all. But when we forget, should I pray that God would bring new people today? Should I pray that God would use me and use my gifts at church? Should I pray that God would give me an encounter with someone that I can encourage them or lift them up? See, maybe those are the questions that we need to be asking, and that when we think about getting ready, for Bible study, for church, for school, for work, that we should be thinking in those terms. Or have we become like the Pharisees, where we're picking out certain things and we're putting Band-Aids over our open wounds, trying to hide behind a fake exterior? And Jesus says, a warning to you if you were doing that. All right, let's finish this up. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You are like whitewashed tombs, which appear beautiful on the outside, but inside are full of dead man's bones and every impurity. In the same way, on the outside you seem righteous to people, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness, which is a particular serious dig against the Pharisees, because being right with the law was what they were very concerned with. So lawlessness, that might not sound particularly accusatory to us, but to them that was a big deal. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we wouldn't have taken part with them in shedding the prophets' blood. So in other words, they look at the past. They're talking about the history of Israel when they had some bad kings and they murdered the prophets and they became allies with the pagan people groups that God told them not to. And then they ended up persecuting and killing their own people and their own godly leaders. And so they condemned them, they judged them. That's what Jesus is talking about. You therefore testify against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your father's sin. Snakes! Exclamation mark. Brood of vipers! Exclamation mark. How can you escape being condemned to hell? This is why I am sending you prophets, sages, and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will flog in your synagogues and hound from town to town. All right, so he's talking about the apostles, his followers that he's going to send out. So this is really a moment of prophecy, and I want you to think about it because we don't see that a lot in the Gospels. This is a moment of prophecy. Well, Jesus is saying, this is what's going to happen. And of course, we know from history that it certainly did happen. And not only did the Romans persecute Christians, but the Jews persecuted Christians greatly. And in fact, Paul, the apostle, which we talked about his conversion on the road to Damascus last week, I think, or maybe the week before last, sometime recently, he was one of them. He was one of these that Jesus was condemning and calling out for change. So all the righteous blood shed on the earth will be charged to you. Wow. Wow. From the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. I assure you all these things will come on this generation. And of course we know that during the Jewish-Roman War of 70 AD, the Jews were wiped out by the Romans. And the temple and all of their exterior religious things were destroyed, and they were greatly diminished as a people group. You know, I think that it's a sobering chapter, and we didn't quite finish it out, but we need to kind of stop at this point. If there is a part of me that is flippant, a part of me that is too casual with God, a part of me that doesn't take the responsibility of following Christ serious enough, that part of me comes out when I read Matthew chapter 23. And I realize the seriousness of it. And while being a follower of Christ, it's about experiencing grace. It's about experiencing a life that is free from sin, free from darkness, free from the worries and the problems of this life. That is certainly the case. But I think there are those sobering times, those serious times when we have to look hard at our life and realize that there are things that need to go away. There are attitudes that we have. And so we don't have, I think for some of us, we want to get on our high horse and we want to kind of go stand by Jesus and start pointing the finger. But Jesus is very clear in His Sermon on the Mount that we just talked about, that it's not our responsibility to judge. It was Jesus' place because He was God. I mean, He was the Emmanuel, the God with us, the God that became flesh. So it is His place to correct others. It's not our place. There's one person that we are responsible for correcting. And that's us. We are that person. And that as we refine, I mean, there's a lot of ways the Bible talks about it. It talks about it in terms of iron, sharpening iron. And, you know, blacksmiths would, first they would pour metal into a mold. And then as it would cool, then they would hammer it out and shape it and mold it. Because, a piece of metal isn't really as useful as a weapon as a sword is, that has sharp edges. And so the Bible talks about it as being like jars of clay. And if you've ever seen that, I have one of my favorite coffee mugs came from Silver Dollar City from a woman who was a believer, and who she fashioned these coffee cups out of clay. You know, a lump of clay, you can't, it's not really useful. You can't really drink out of it until it takes the shape of a cup. And so the Bible talks about all these ways that we are like the clay, like the metal, that we're this raw material. And then God is shaping us and He's molding us into something useful. See, the Pharisees were not fulfilling their purpose. They were called to be like Moses. I mean, Jesus even says that they had a responsibility, that someone has the responsibility to lead. But they were remaining lumps of clay. They were remaining just raw iron ore. And they weren't being shaped into something useful. And Jesus is saying, you need to be, he was trying to shape them, although they wouldn't hear it. They refused to hear it because they were so arrogant that they weren't teachable. But the man or the woman or the child that is concerned with following Jesus ought to be serious about this warning. That God has called us to a life of holiness. He's called us to a life free from sin. Well, what does that really mean? Well, we are freed from sin in a spiritual sense, that when we become saved, the Holy Spirit comes to live in us, and that we have eternal security, so that when we die, we'll go to heaven. That's certainly the case, but there's something even deeper than that. That we are no longer slaves to it. That we don't have to corrupt our lives with a bunch of junk anymore. That we're freed from that. We can actually now choose to fill our life with good things. And for some of us, that's issues of using substances. For some of us, that's issues of addictions. For some of us, that's issues with anger, issues with judgment, issues with pride. You know, it's amazing how different we all are, that we all struggle with different things, but yet we're really the same. We're really all fellow strugglers. That's really what we are. Because we struggle together to get rid of the old things, to get rid of the things that ensnare us and keep us from being the person that God wants us to be. And so the promise that God has offered up here of being free from those things sometimes eludes us because we just refuse to be refined. We just don't want to be made into that useful thing because it hurts. It can be painful. It can be hard. I mean, there's nothing worse, in my opinion, than learning patience. Because you have to wait to learn patience, right? I hate that. I can't stand that. There's nothing that makes me crazier than having to wait. And yet, many times, God tells us to wait. And for our culture especially, that's a terrible message because we want it right now. We want to drive up to one window, pay, and go to the next window and have our food. And if it takes more than 60 seconds, then we're already huffing and puffing. We want our coffee hot. Now we want to wait for it to heat up on the stove, so we microwave it. We don't want to wait for our stuff to be shipped, for several weeks. So we do Amazon Prime or Amazon Next Day so that it gets flown to us. I mean, good grief, how ridiculous is that? And I'm talking to myself because I've done this within the last month. They would pay $3.99 extra to get it the next day when we could just wait a few more days and not have to pay for that. That has got to be a symptom of a serious problem. And so here we are. We're these that have been called to this great calling, to be followers of Christ, to be ones that are given the ultimate mission with ultimate truth and value, and yet we settle for something less. And in trying to reconcile that, we create all these artificial things that don't really matter so that we can deceive ourselves and we can deceive everyone else into thinking that we're right with God. So we're going to take some time to pray, and David, if you'll bring the lights down just a little bit. And this has been a pretty hard message, I realize that, and I can see some of you guys like, okay, I get the point. Can we please stop talking about this? It's like my children when they get in trouble and they know what they did wrong and they know I'm coming and I'm going to talk all about what they did wrong. I can just see on their faces like, can we just get to the end? Can we just be done with this conversation? But yet, we're really not ever done, are we? Until Christ completes the work that He's begun in us, which really doesn't happen until we go to be with Him. After we die, we're called to a life of being refined, of being changed, of being more like Jesus. So we can choose to do it, we can choose to really live that out and be that real person, or we can just hide in the fog of sin and darkness and ambiguity and never really do anything significant in our whole lives. So let's just take some time. I think it's the right thing to do, and if Annette will come up and just play, or Taylor, or somebody that's in here, we would just think about that and take some time and go to the Lord and say, God, would you just show me these areas where you need me to be refined today, this next week, this next month, and begin that refining process in me. Let's pray. God, I just cry out to you as the one that has the ability to deliver me from evil, who is the hands that shape me and mold me. God, as we pause for just a moment in our very busy, our very impatient lives, Lord, would you help us to find the path that we need to be on, so that we would be happy, so that we would be at peace, so that we would find purpose, and most importantly, so that we would be right with you. Could I pray for each one that is in this room today? God, I think everybody in here wants to do the right thing. And sometimes it's hard to know what the right thing is. Sometimes doing the right thing requires a great sacrifice. So Lord, I'm not praying that you would spare us from that sacrifice, that you would spare us from the struggle. But Lord, I am asking that you would give us the strength, you would give us the boldness to overcome, to be made stronger, to be made more patient, more loving, more gentle, more joyful, more persevering. Ultimately, Lord, to be made more like you. Lord, you are great and you see everything. Everything that has happened, everything that will happen, and you know what is best for us. God, would you lead us? Would you teach us? In Jesus' name.